Okay. We're going to talk about how this fits within the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in a theory. You got a good dose of that today from Chad, I think earlier, but it is important to see it from that context. Then we'll talk about kind of an overview of the product, some of the key features that are in there, and we'll spend a little bit of time on one little scenario I'm going to try to illustrate for you before we wrap up. Chad shared this chart earlier today, right? The idea is to build agility and resilience into our supply chain. So it's about things like model configuration, variance analysis, and using your demand-driven S&OP process not to boil the ocean, but to really look at how do we ensure that our demand-driven operating model has the flexibility to meet whatever conditions may come our way. So being able to test against a range of forecasts or different scenarios, to me, is a far more effective way to get to the right answers versus assuming you're going to be able to get a perfect plan laid out and then finding it goes, to hell on you as time goes by. And I think this offers an opportunity from an S&OP standpoint to really lighten the workload, make it not as organizationally taxing as it is in so many environments. And I think there's a lot of promise for that we can really take advantage of. You still need to look forward. There's no question about that. It's about how do you use that information to get the right insights and perspectives to make your environment better. So we've had this module, it was called the Advanced Planning Module for a while, and then we switched when we came out with the Intuiflow branding to call it S&OP. I would just share an observation that in some ways, we kind of misbranded this in a way because there were some clients that weren't doing S&OP, and so they thought the module wasn't for them. And in reality, it's providing the vehicle for giving you forward visibility to your inventory and material planning. MRP will show you a weekly progression going out into the future for however long you feed it, right? And if you look at DDMRP, it'll tell you what to do today. It's not going to tell you what to do tomorrow or next week. It's going to tell you what to do today, right? So there was a little bit, from my standpoint, of a blind spot there if I'm a planner, I don't know what's going to happen next week. I don't have any visibility to that. And that's what this module provides you. So it's not just to support an S&OP, formal S&OP process. It's also there to give you what I call that consistent view of how the buffers have behaved historically, what they're recommending today, and what they look like they'll be doing in the future. And the interesting story on this, I was working with Coca-Cola in Australia. We had implemented DDMRP buffers for 2 production lines. Things were going great. Inventories were coming down. They were generating fewer production orders and smaller volumes. Things were settling in a wonderful way. And all of a sudden, a crisis emerged because the operations side of the house, who was looking at their forward-looking projections, planning staff, and doing all the normal operational things that they had to do, was seeing that it looked like they were going to have to add extra shift capacity in the coming weeks. And why was that? It was because the forward-looking projections that they were getting coming out of SAP APO were based on MRP-based safety stock logic. And it was saying, you are way below what we think you should be at because of what their MRP settings were, right? So now it's trying to make up for the fact that we're shortening down, we're slowing down the production so that the inventory comes down. And yet all of a sudden we've got this distorted signal. And that was really a big impetus for me around doing this. We solved that problem for them using our Excel-based simulation tool because we could feed it the forecast and it showed that in fact you didn't need that incremental production. But it really kind of emphasized that, boy, we need to have that more complete view of the horizon. So this module, even if you're not doing a formal S&OP process, gives you that forward visibility. It projects based on your forecast how the buffers are going to behave. And there were some very useful insights you get out of that in terms of, seasonal events, promotional activity, periods of shutdown, all sorts of other factors that you do want to have a perspective on so that you can react to in time. So it ties into the S&OP process, but it's also kind of a surrogate for the MRP controller screen that you may be thinking about that's showing you projected, inventory, supply and demand out over the future. It improves the management of our settings. allows you to deal with seasonalities, buffer promotions. It helps with rough cut capacity planning. And we'll even share a set of scenarios at the end of the pitch around unique use cases that we found for the module that have kind of been a little bit of a surprise, came out of different environments and different situations. So now, whoops. The idea here is that we want to take this idea of exception management. So it's hard to see on the screen, but we're going to create some projected reports. Your projected supply, projected inventory, what we call a promotional report. And two of those really have a lot of merit for you, because if you can see where you're going to have potential inventory disruptions or ruptures, then there may need to be a corrective action. And there's a range of factors that may influence that. We wanted to have a view of promotional events or forecasted events that deviate substantially from your average weekly demand. So you can see these thresholds here. We normally set them around 60% of the red zone would be a medium priority. If inventory got below that, hey, take a look, it might be getting a little bit too skinny. If it got below 40% of the red zone, it might be a higher alert that, hey, this is a more serious one. And then obviously if it goes below 0 at any point in the simulation, make it critical, because that would be a potential stock out that we want to mitigate. On the promotional side, we would look at thresholds. I typically recommend 200% of my average weekly demand. If I have a week that demand is that great, tell me about it, alert that as maybe a medium. If it's 300% of weekly demand, average weekly demand, then we would call it high. Maybe 400 or 500% would be severe. And the whole reason is to just give you a way to take all the massive data that so many companies are dealing with, try to filter it down to show me what I really need to look at. The analogy I always use is the pilot flying across the Atlantic to Europe is rarely flying the plane. We're all sleeping in the back, right? But he's got a way with the dashboard and the console and the radar screens and all that to give him alerts and warnings about things to keep an eye on. And let's try to filter down what we need to pay attention to in that process. There's a couple other settings in here you can simulate based on demand, all being recognized one day a week, or you can spread it evenly across the working calendar days of the week. The reason we gave that option is that some people have customers for every item and they are shipping every day, so spreading it evenly across the week makes sense. In other cases, it's much more of a make-to-order environment or something like that, where it's going to be rather spiky, so you can just pick one day of the week and you'll get a more volatile demand pattern that you're trying to support from that. Then there's also a daily usage report that's analyzing whether the forward rate of demand compared to today's rate of demand is deviating substantially, either up or down, because an item could be all of a sudden falling off the radar screen from a standpoint of market demand. Let's slow that thing down. Or it could be going the other direction and where we need to ramp up. We're getting into a seasonal period or some other factor. We've opened up a new channel of distribution and this item may be taking off. So again, you're getting alerts based on the settings that you establish. You can also simulate using demand histories. Wally illustrated that at the part level, but you can use this for all the demand history for all the items in the cohort. Why would that be a value? Well, this is kind of like playing Monday morning quarterback, right? Here's our buffer trend graph of how we actually achieved. Now let's go back and say, had we done perfect planning and followed the system recommendations, what would we have actually been able to achieve? Takes the demand history as its data input, runs that through and generates the results. And you'll see all the S&OP type reports are available for it as well. You can look at it by product category and all sorts of different dimensions. Quite useful. As part of our go-to-market and sales activity, we always do simulations for our clients as a way of demonstrating whether there is a business case for them to move forward. And it's a quite valuable experience. So we've done that historically in Excel tools or a Power BI thing that we built. We're going to start doing all of this now directly in the software, and we want the customer to be able to have the option to do that for themselves. It's a way of auditing how you're doing and comparing the way your planning team's performing versus what you might have been able to do had you let the system do the work for you, right? We also have exception thresholds for the RCCP side. You know, if My capacity requirement, the load is getting to within 80–90% of capacity. Tell me about that so I can take a look. Or if it's going above, you can set different thresholds. And then it's also there for a summary load threshold, meaning I could have a category of resources that I want to have views of, and I want to see how they look in aggregate because I may have multiple machines like lathes or milling machines, and it gives me a better sense of how to do that. On the RCCP side, we can do that either as the resources are taken from the resource editor. Miles didn't show you that today when he went through the scheduling and execution module, but there's a whole bunch of resource definitions and calendars, the resource calendars. It's utilizing all that base information in generating the RCCP perspective. You even could have the ability, and I'll show you this potentially tomorrow when we go through the constrained supply topic, of modeling supplier constraints. And I'll show you an example where you've got an external constraint that's impacting, and you could generate from that a constrained MPS to slow down ordering of materials to the pace that that constrained material may allow you to use in actual production. The projected supply requirements, this is showing what are we going to be generating in terms of order requirements. For make items, this will be your projected workloads by week, by item, going out over the horizon. We support up to 78 weeks now. We're expecting to double that to 3 years because someone needs to look 3 years down the road. Vendor, we're using this to share concentrate requirements for Coca-Cola to their concentrate side of the house, right? So it's just, there's APIs that support that. They send that information out. In the automotive industry, we're using this to feed EDI signals out to the supplier network and the like. You can see here the projected supply requirements by week, by item, and then at the summary level, based on the filtering you've done, it shows you what the totals are for that cohort. And then here you can see the projection graph is the buffer projection going forward. You also have access to the analytic view of what the trailing views have been. This information also can be used, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, to feed logistics estimates on freight and stuff like that, if this is a set of buy items. The projected inventory alert. This is looking at where do we see potential inventory exposures. This could be base buffer settings that are incorrect. It could also be promotional events or other activities that we want to analyze. In this first case, this was an interesting one, actually. When I ran this, this had a BOM effectivity date where there was a label on this SKU's bill of material that was coming up for expiration. It had not been, the new revision had not been buffered yet. So because it was non-buffered, it had a longer lead time. And you can see it had a slower response to replenishing itself. So it would have been a call for buffer that follow-on item, use the part transition logic Wally talked to you about in our last module, and we would have avoided that situation. Nothing else would have needed to be done. As you cursor down, you can see the different situations. You've got these alert thresholds. One thing I didn't point out on the settings, you set what your relevant range is. If my operating horizon, my tactical horizon, as Chad would call it, is only 12 or 13 weeks out, I shouldn't be signaling alerts 26 weeks from now. You're just creating noise that you don't need to respond to. By then, something will change, right? So you want to be judicious about how far out you set those horizons. Less is more. You know, just put it out. To me, your longest decoupled lead time, plus maybe a few extra weeks, ought to be long enough to give you the right kind of alert mechanism to take corrective actions where and if they'll be required. And ideally, we should see a very small mix of items showing up on projected inventory if our foundation, our base buffer settings have been established correctly. Should mention that the S&OP module will also project all of your non-buffered items. Those are boring graphs because everything always lines up. Demand and supply is always lining up. So the inventory is trading right around zero all the time, unless there's MOQs and other factors to deal with. But we can handle both the non-buffered and buffered items. The promotion report is looking for periods where the average demand and the peak demand for that period is inflecting. In this case, it's a 410% variance based on that, again, relevant range horizon. So It's a good way to say, okay, do we have these things? Some of these may not be causing inventory issues. You can monitor campaigns and things like that if you're doing events like that. And it really is quite helpful in that regard. The RCCP view, a lot of people like to do this with an unconstrained environment, so you can see the actual peaks and valleys, how much gaps you've got. If you set the resource definitions in the system as constraints, they will be finitely level loaded, if you will. It will generate a revised release or a production schedule based on that constraints, pulling things in earlier. So if we had a promotional event and we had to pre-build stock, and I'll show you this when I do the little demo at the end, where we're going to pull some production forward, it would then be able to look at that, say, is there enough capacity to deal with that requirement? And if not, pull it earlier in time, assuming you're starting far enough in advance to be able to give you that view. You can see both the resource load graph in a bar format or as well the hours and other estimates. It factors in things like shutdown periods and whatnot. So it's really a very, kind of holistic view of what your capacity view is. And then you can see down here the summary thresholds for this cadre of bottling lines in our demo example. Questions on that? Okay. The projected buffer trend is a very useful tool. You might get a question from your CFO is when are you going to get inventory aligned to your target levels from your DDMRP buffers? It will show you based on the forecast how quickly you can get there. You can filter by vendor, by make or buy, all sorts of different elements. You get views of what your projected service levels are, and that is really a measurement of what we call days stocked out. In this case, I'm looking at 99%. So that would be 99% of all items, or 99% of the days for all items, there is inventory available of a positive value. It's not a true service level thing. It's more of a day stocked out kind of a measurement. And it shows you what the projected inventory levels are, how long it'll take you to get in line with your targets, how long you'll be able to take before you can get rid of your over top of green positions and things like that. And then Wally's talked about part simulation. This is quite handy tool. It's really useful in terms of just making sure that you've got a view of what the right settings would be. Wally mentioned that we've got AI ML red zone settings that you can base on different service level thresholds you want to hit. We'll talk about those a little bit more tomorrow during the autopilot module. So other use cases. This is a unique one that Rustin knows a little bit about. You can utilize the S&OP module to generate firm orders to your suppliers. We've got some examples in the automotive industry where they're sending a signal via EDI once a week, buying materials from a given supplier, but they have a planning calendar that allows pickups 3 days a week. So what we found is that there were situations where we were sending the EDI signal, giving the right workbench signal for the order on that day, but then the subsequent days were still an MRP-based signal. We were replacing the MRP signal just on the first day of the week. And in actuality, again, you got that distortion that I mentioned earlier, where if the SAP settings aren't exactly aligned to your buffers, those values are going to be different than what we would have ordered. So we're actually using the module now to send the supplier signal for all of the orders for that week. So we're ordering in essence a weekly batch, even though the orders may be spread across more than one day of the week. And I think that's a really unique way of utilizing a module that's working quite effectively in that environment. Mentioned earlier, we can send forecasted requirements down to suppliers. We can use this for a number of different analytical views. Coke also uses it for projecting space requirements. There's pre-build periods as they lead up to peak season. So you can convert based on the part packaging table into pallets, hours, all those different dimensions Wally talked about, and get a sense of how much warehouse space do I need as we go through the year and get views on that. Because the supply orders for your vendors, you would actually see how many orders you could be generating. And if you have the logistic data, you would be able to gain a view of what your freight spends would be based on these estimated requirements as well. And then finally, by setting, whether it's a make item or a buy item, by setting constraints, modeling a supplier constraint as an example, you can build a constrained master production schedule from the output of the system if you set that resource in as a constraint. And so it gives you a little bit different way of using some of the outputs from the S&OP module that aren't really pure S&OP related, but more kind of operationally beneficial and things like that. Questions on any of those? Oops, Alt Tab. And we're going to go here. All right, we're in the software. We're going to go over to the S&OP module first. And we're going to look at our modeling environment. And what we'll do first is I want to show the correlation between this and the demand planning. So we'll go into demand planning. We'll see our forecast here, or we'll pick one of the pack sizes that we're looking at. And I don't know what's happening here. Hang on. Oh, okay. We'll see if we can do this on the fly. We're going to go by pack size. And we're going to filter by location that exactly matches bottler. Voila. Okay, so I'm going to undo this guy. And what we're going to look at here is the 2-pack of 2-liter or 6-pack of 2-liter bottles. These are the values that we've been running from the standpoint of what the forecast is. I believe that's what was loaded in here. We should see that these match up on the promotion report. No, something happened here. Sorry. There we go. And we're going to go pick. Okay. So I'm not going to bother sending. No, we're going to go ahead and do this. Let's do this. We're going to make an adjustment here. And what we'll do is we're going to put a promotional event here out in week 21. We're going to put a real big one out there, 500,000 units. And we'll go ahead and save that. And then what I'm going to do is send that back to Intuiflow. And what we're trying to show here, if we look at the job schedule, it'll say it's loading the forecast back. That's done. We come back to the instance and we go to the data import screen. We can see that the demand forecast came across and processed. We're now going to go back to the S&OP module. And what we'll do is we'll run a shorter horizon because we don't need to go too far out into the future here. We'll short this down to 26 weeks. And we'll go ahead and run that. And what this will do now is it's going to take that forecasted input. We know we put a big promotion out in that 1 week. And it's going to go through and recycle the forecast, make adjustments based on that. The site is set up to trickle down or explode down the forecast to child components. So we would not only see this at the end item level, but we'd also be able to see it at the component level as well. See if the job finished. It did. So we'll go back here. And we should see our big promotion out there on our bottling line, or the pack size there. So you see the 500,000 units that we put in. And if we look at these items, we can see that there's going to be some pretty severe buffer issues because we've got such a large demand that came in. Maybe a retail channel went out on, wanted a big promotional event for some reason or whatever. So you can see we've got a number of factors out there that we're going to have to deal with. And what we're going to do then is we're going to utilize this idea of intelligent adjustments. So this is a feature where it's going to look across the horizon and look for situations where inventory goes below, I believe the setting is 50% of the red zone. And if it does, it will create automatically an intelligent adjustment to raise and anticipate and create a correction for that. The idea here is that we're trying to give you the tools so that if adjustments are going to be needed for like a promotional event, or over in Europe, they've got holiday shutdowns for 3 weeks and stuff like that, where there's not going to be any production capability. It works in the other way where we don't want to overaccumulate inventory because there's not going to be any demand during those periods. It would allow us to make those corrections for them. So we'll go back to that promotion report. And what you're going to see here in the projections are these adjustments, and I used the wrong forecast week because it's too early. But if you look here, there's adjustments at the very, very beginning of the period. I'm not very good with a touchpad. There we go. You can see here that there is an artificial adjustment to the buffer based on this cycle day adjustment factor that was created by the system. So the idea here is that we can utilize the tool to help create the adjustments for the users. They can review those, and then if there was a requirement to make any further adjustments, they'd be able to do that. You'd be able to see the adjustment factors in the CDAF tab here. And if you look at those, there's intelligent adjustments. And these are the ones that the system has generated. They start with a prefix of an S and create an attribute. They're done at the item level. Obviously, in a campaign like that, not every buffered item is going to need the same kind of correction. So it's going to kind of calibrate that back based on the different needs. If we were to rerun that and turn the intelligent adjustment factors off, it would go back to its normal setting. So those were some of the key things. There's a lot more we could go into here. We didn't really have the time to go a lot deeper in terms of functionality. There is quite a bit of Power BI reporting that's coupled to this. Bernard Millian, who is our leader over in Europe, has done a phenomenal job of building out a whole array of reports. I think Dan's going to be showing those to you here in a minute, that allow you to get a real great view of the output from the S&OP module on a number of different dimensions, including different levels of aggregation and disaggregation and things like that.